Good afternoon, everyone, and it's a rather unpleasant afternoon, so gratitude to everyone for coming out for what's going to be a really interesting talk. My name is Sarah Chayes, and I'm at the Democracy and Rule of Law program here at Carnegie. I want to first let you know we are live international today as part of the global observance of World Anti-Corruption Day. So we encourage all of you to join this conversation as it's going on Twitter. Hashtag is Break the Chain. It gives me enormous pleasure and pride to introduce to you one of the most dynamic and creative public servants that the United States has the good fortune to claim. Undersecretary of State for Civilian Security, Democracy, and Human Rights, Sarah Sewall. Throughout her career, as the first Deputy Assistant Secretary ever of Defense for Peacekeeping and Humanitarian Assistance, in her work on the famous Field Manual 324 that revolutionized the approach to the Iraq War, many people thought that her introduction to the best-selling paperback was the most valuable part of that document. In her incredibly insightful and operationable research on civilian casualties, and so many other endeavors, Undersecretary Sewall has been at the cutting edge of the intersection between security and the protection and the rights of civilian populations. Today, on World Anti-Corruption Day, she'll be turning her incisive mind to help us understand another aspect of this nexus, and one which many of you may know has been a particular concern here at Carnegie. It's the security implications of acute public corruption. So please join me in welcoming Undersecretary of State Sarah Sewall.
Thanks, Sarah, for that introduction. It's really lovely to be able to collaborate with friends. And here, on a topic that Sarah has most recently been contributing on, it's really a pleasure to join you. And thank you all for coming out on this dreary day. It is an important moment, though, to reflect on a phenomenon that seems to be increasingly evident sort of everywhere you turn. And so I want to start by saying that it was only 11 years ago that the UN General Assembly designated this calendar day as International Anti-Corruption Day. And I think it's fair to say that both international and national efforts to combat corruption have moved dramatically. We've seen a lot of progress in a short time. And predictably, as the arc of most progress progresses, you see that norms are the place where you make the most progress right up front. And implementation is not always keeping pace with normative development. And so I think that's the moment that we're at as we are here today on this 11th International Anti-Corruption Day. And I want to explain at the outset why I think anti-corruption is a priority for the United States. A national security concern and an often underappreciated national security concern. And I want to talk about the ways in which we can combat corruption in a more tailored, integrated, and effective way. My own perspective on corruption is a bit unique. I'm the undersecretary in what's known as J within the State Department, and we handle policy and programs on issues that range from terrorism to refugees, security sector reform, human rights, preventing conflict. Part of what makes the J Undersecretariat different is that we look at the world, we look at international affairs through the eyes of people as much as we look at foreign policy as it pertains to governments. And so when you think about the impact that corruption has on people, you see that it is something that fundamentally changes the complexion of their experience on this planet, in addition to what we traditionally think of as the effects of corruption on international economics, regional security, and good governance. So our J perspective really begins from the premise that corruption is a populist scourge, and that securing human rights and personal safety and opportunity for all necessarily entails combating corruption. And the more I understand about the challenges that each of the individual bureaus and offices within the J Undersecretariat face in their daily work, the more clearly I see corruption as an endemic threat that weaves throughout much of what would otherwise appear to be very disparate efforts, and that collectively erodes the trust, the efficiency, and the justice that healthy societies require. So we all know corruption is bad, and I want to disaggregate 3 different negative effects of corruption. 1, its impact on human development. 2, its impact on economic vibrancy. And 3, its impact on security. And because I am the Undersecretary for Civilian Security, I'm going to highlight insecurity as perhaps the most underappreciated element. And again, shouting out to Sarah Chase for doing so much to highlight that particular element of corruption. So 1, human development, human rights impacts. When politicians steal public funds instead of spending them appropriately, you have a host of different effects. Schools go without books, patients go without medicine, merchants go without bridges and roads. For an audience that is familiar with corruption, none of these statistics are going to sound particularly shocking, but just imagine for a second that you hadn't heard them before. The African Union estimates that 1/4 of Africa's GDP is lost every year due to corruption, dramatically increasing levels of poverty in an already heartbreakingly poor region. Health sector, World Bank estimates, surveys show that in some countries, up to 80% of non-salary funds never reach local facilities. In the health sector alone, World Bank surveys show I just said that. So then we're surprised when Ebola hits that the infrastructure, that the institutions that are supposed to handle a crisis lack the capability to do so effectively. Graft phrased the fabric of the social contract, undermining attempts by governments to assert legitimacy or establish democracy. And corruption is also the glue that holds together many authoritarian regimes, giving rulers the ability to divide spoils and share opportunities and use opportunities, exploit opportunities to out the dirt on cronies when it becomes convenient or if they turn disloyal. So corruption leaves citizens vulnerable. And when their rights are effectively up for sale, the laws that are supposed to protect people, to halt human trafficking, hate crimes, gender-based violence, go unenforced. And we see this, for example, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, where victims of crime, including sexual violence, have little access to the justice system. And even when they do, they often find that their perpetrators are likely to simply buy their way out of prosecution. The U.S. is busy supporting mobile courts in the DRC to make justice more accessible in rural areas, but this intervention will not be able to succeed if corruption persists within the court system. So you see, you take action X, but if you're not looking holistically at the problem, you're going to still have limited ability to address the problem because of the impact of corruption. On the economic side, growth, competition, innovation, very well documented impacts on corruption. When companies have to pay bribes to cut through red tape, it actually has the perverse effect of incentivizing the creation of more red tape, further slowing transaction times and raising business expenses. World Economic Forum estimates that around the world, corruption adds an average of up to 10% to the cost of doing business. And of course, from an American perspective, corruption has a particularly harmful effect on U.S. companies that play by the rules, supported by robust enforcement here at home. It becomes an unequal playing field for us. When we go to compete overseas, corruption robs our companies of that level playing field. And if a public procurement decision in Russia is made not on the basis of merit, but on the basis of bribery, our companies will either stay home or they will lose the bid. And that affects our economy and puts pressures on our businesses to cut corners. And it also means that, of course, Russian consumers lose out because they're receiving substandard products because the contractors are spending overhead on bribes instead of workmanship. So shared prosperity, which is the goal of the international economic system, shared prosperity in its truest form requires a shared commitment to transparent, rule-based economies that work in the best interest of citizens and of the United States and our partners overseas. Part of this commitment, of course, is protecting our own financial systems from harboring stolen assets. Proceeds of corruption are often sheltered in banks or in shell corporations in Western Europe and the United States. And these ill-gotten gains frequently are used to prop up unaccountable regimes or finance terrorism. We're working with our partners, especially at the G20, to guarantee that our financial systems are not havens for stolen assets. And it has become relatively more easy to trace how corruption erodes democracy and eats away at prosperity. We now have several tools, such as the World Bank and UN measures of corruption's impact on development, the State Department's Human Rights Report, NGOs like Transparency International that document corruption's impact on freedom and accountability, and institutions like the OECD that quantify corruption's impact on business. But corruption has other impacts, perhaps more difficult to measure, but no less insidious. It turns out that corruption is even more dangerous than we had thought, for the very simple reason that corruption alienates and angers citizens. And this can cause them to lose faith in their state, or worse, fuel insurgencies and violent extremism. Examples abound. In Afghanistan, the Taliban continue to exploit public discontent with corruption to garner support. In Iraq, disillusionment with government, including its corruption, creates fertile soil for ISIL to exploit. And just last week, Iraqi Prime Minister al-Abadi discovered that 50,000 ghost soldiers were listed on government payrolls, costing Iraqis approximately $380 million a year. Now, citizens feel betrayed by these scams, both indirectly, because their taxes and resources are enriching nominal public servants, but also directly, because they do not receive the security and the protection that they both finance and require. Take the example of Nigeria. There, corruption has hollowed out the national military, leaving soldiers underfed, underpaid, and unable to defend citizens against internal threats, principally from Boko Haram. The cost is grave. 2014 alone, Boko Haram has already killed more than 4,000 people, displaced some 1.5 million. It's declared an Islamic caliphate in northeast Nigeria. It's taken the reins of governance in some communities. And while the United States is working with Nigeria to confront the threat, to prevent atrocities, that work is much harder to do because of corruption's corrosive effects on the military. Transparency International has found that many countries have weak controls over defense procurement, risking similarly debilitating outcomes. And the challenge of corruption cuts deeply across the security sector. For example, countless police turn the other way at checkpoints, and customs officials look the other way at borders, all in exchange for bribes. And this paves the way for drug cartels, terrorists, and other international security threats. Consider that in the wake of the Westgate attack in Kenya, the police arrested and detained suspected al-Shabaab terrorists. But according to Human Rights Watch, suspects could simply buy their release by paying a bribe of approximately $100. So in this way, corruption can enable local threats that have broader implications for security around the globe. And corruption complicates post-conflict peace building because those who profited from the war economy are then best placed to win political power and, surprise, surprise, through corruption, continue serving their narrow interests. Ukraine provides another illustration of how corruption can both increase instability risks and cripple the state's ability to respond to those risks. The Maidan movement was driven in part by resentment of a kleptocratic regime parading around in democratic trappings. Corruption had drained service delivery, scared off investment, and crippled the justice system. Businesses and even foreign countries had for years bought and bribed their way into political influence over Ukrainian legislative and procurement decisions. And as public frustration boiled, Russian interference escalated. Security institutions that were needed to fend off the Russian aggression struggled to mount an adequate defense. They'd been weakened by years of graft, rendering them ineffective. And Nigeria and Ukraine are not just cautionary tales, they're wake-up calls for the international community. And that's why our embassies in 24 countries in Central and Eastern Europe are currently drafting action plans for supporting and cooperating on anti-corruption reform in their host country. Corruption, then, is not just an affront to American values. Left unaddressed, corruption in distant lands can cut to the heart of our national security. And yet I'm unaware of any security organization that systematically monitors corruption. The international community is only starting to grapple with the seriousness of corruption's destabilizing security impacts. So that's the disaggregation of three different impacts from corruption. And it's clear that the challenge is extremely important. It's also clear that addressing this challenge comprehensively is really tough. But I think it's worth underscoring both the range of tools that we have and some of the concrete impact that we can see as a result of our efforts. At the State Department, the Bureau of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement works on corruption, along with bureaus that handle economics, energy, and human rights. And together, State collaborates with USAID, with Treasury, Department of Justice, Interior, and Commerce. Each of these brings specialized tools to the table. We leverage international conventions, pressing governments to implement their commitments that they've made to combating corruption. We include anti-corruption provisions in free trade agreements, and we apply financial sanctions to protect U.S. markets from the stability and liability risks of harboring the proceeds of corruption. We enforce the Corrupt Practices Act, which since 2009 has generated around $3 billion in penalties and convictions against more than 50 individuals, including high-level executives. At the State Department, we use our visa sanction authority in a non-political manner to deny entry to corrupt leaders. Recently, we denied visas to 6 Hungarian officials and their cronies due to corruption, and that action in turn bolstered public concern. And on November 9th, the streets of Budapest filled with 10,000 protesters calling for the resignation of corrupt public officials. We provide at least $600 million a year to build the capacity of foreign governments to combat corruption, largely through the strengthening of law enforcement mechanisms. And we support independent civil society organizations so that they can press their governments to prevent and combat corruption, such as in the Czech Republic, where 20 NGOs banded together to form an anti-corruption coalition supported in part by a grant from the U.S. Embassy. The U.S. is co-chairing the G20 Anti-Corruption Working Group with Turkey in an effort to drive a race to the top on issues like beneficial ownership, which would require companies to identify the actual person who owns or controls them, in line with the president's recent proposed legislation on beneficial ownership. And we're proud to have helped launch the Open Government Partnership in September 2011, bringing global civil society and governments from 65 countries to strengthen the internal vertical relationships of accountability between governments and their citizenry at home. 2/3 of these countries have included commitments to anti-corruption or whistleblower protection in the latest round of their OGP national action plans, each of which were developed through a consultative process between civil society and government. And today we're helping prevent corruption in the oil, gas, and mining sectors by supporting the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative and implementing our own commitments domestically. Now, our efforts have impact. We've supported the International Commission Against Impunity in Guatemala 3 months ago. Both the director and deputy director of the Guatemalan penitentiary system were arrested for receiving bribes in return for prisoners' transfers, and they were later charged with money laundering and corruption. In Nigeria and Sierra Leone, we were supporting civil society and government leaders to participate in a civic code-a-thon event that has generated new open government tools, such as infographics in Nigeria, that clearly explained in simple terms the proposed federal budget. And in the country of Georgia, the government's following through on its OGP commitments to combat corruption by making political party financing transparent and developing an online system for government procurement. These are just some examples of the impact that we are able to have. But given the complexity and the entrenchment of corruption in many countries, the United States must become more focused, more creative, and more collaborative as we continue working to enhance our anti-corruption impact. First, what does it mean to become more focused? In the past year, the U.S. government has developed interagency mechanisms to foster better unity of effort across the different entities that I mentioned before working on anti-corruption efforts. And we are working to determine where we should be better prioritizing our anti-corruption resources, which are the countries in which corruption poses the greatest impact to U.S. interests, and the countries in which our interventions are likely to have the greatest effect. Applying this prioritized approach requires integrating a range of tools targeted at a range of actors, a comprehensive soup-to-nuts approach that hits enough nodes of corruption to generate real momentum for action. For instance, in areas of Central America, One cannot just address police corruption without also looking at corruption in other elements of the justice system, such as judges and prisons and even politics. Otherwise, islands of integrity that we build up in the police force are going to be quickly washed away by the tide of corruption in other parts of the corruption ecosystem. Applying a comprehensive approach to focus countries means continuing to mainstream consideration of corruption into all of our development and security programming so that what we don't necessarily identify as anti-corruption efforts are nonetheless reinforcing efforts that go by the name of anti-corruption. And this is the kind of approach that was first laid out in USAID's 2005 anti-corruption strategy. We can do more to better implement that. In Mozambique, USAID's health program is increasing access to clean water, and as an example of what it means to layer your anti-corruption efforts, they're simultaneously building up civil society and putting community groups in charge of governing the wells. It doesn't guarantee that there cannot be corruption, but residents are better equipped to hold local leaders accountable for delivering community goods. And we'll continue pressing for anti-corruption synergy across our efforts, including expanding consideration of corruption in our security partnership. It's sort of the next venue for us to really focus in on what it means to layer anti-corruption and integrate it. Secondly, what does it mean to adopt creative approaches to corruption? First, you have to tailor them to the local context. You can't just take best practices and plonk them in point B because they worked in point A. But you need to emphasize the anti-corruption law enforcement by working on the prevention pieces so that you're not just relying on after-the-fact prosecutions. So as you think about what it means to help prevent corrupt acts, you're brought into a broader web of commerce and government to consider such questions as what would make a DMV, for illustrative purposes only, employee decide not to demand a little extra in exchange for getting a driver's license? Well, perhaps part of what you do is you simply streamline the process for getting the driver's license so that there are fewer discretionary transactions that can occur along that chain. Estonia has pioneered this model, developing e-governance tools that have made government operations both more transparent and accountable to civil society, business, the media, and citizens. Another way that you can be more creative in thinking about prevention is to ensure that public employees are paid adequately at the outset. If they can make their ends meet from salaries, and this is also true in the security sector, they're going to be less likely to demand a bribe. But boosting transparency remains sort of a cornerstone of prevention, helping people understand what the actual rules are so that they cannot be misled between what is actually a real fee and what is essentially a bribe concocted on the spot. In Nepal, a wiki platform supported by the NGO, the Accountability Lab, crowdsources information on topics such as getting a birth certificate, driver's license, so that Nepalis can demand proper procedures as they enter into transactions, and government employees know that they can be held accountable if they break the rules. Websites like IPaidAbribe.com go one step further, enabling citizens in India to shed light on their first-hand experiences of corruption to help track graft at local agencies. And these simple, transparent procedures have a dual benefit. Not only do they make government more efficient, they remove opportunities for corruption. The third way in which I think the U.S. will continue to evolve its anti-corruption efforts is through partnerships, both inside and outside government. Tackling corruption demands support from civil society as well as multinational partners simply because the problem is so complex and the solutions must be so long-term. And therefore, even as we work to boost anti-corruption programming funds at state and AID, we're exploring how to increase collaboration with the private sector and multilateral development banks to expand our impact. And in the coming years, we're going to be building out an experimental anti-corruption university, an initiative that will involve exchanges between our diplomats and universities and NGOs around the world on best practices and creating a community. Ultimately, no one nation can do this work alone. So overall, we have a diverse toolkit, and we're striving to apply it more strategically. And yet, even so, the biggest factor in the success or failure of U.S. efforts remains something largely outside of our control, and that is the extent to which foreign government officials choose to support increased accountability or work to block it. In the end, it remains a fundamental question of political will. And so when Vice President Biden is asking the question about why Plan Colombia works, he points out it's not simply because we invested $9 billion in it or because Colombia invested $36 billion in it. More fundamentally, it was about the political commitment that Colombia invested in that process, which included more transparent, accountable governance. And political will means that those brought up on anti-corruption charges are actually the biggest violators of corruption laws, not simply the biggest political rivals. Success of anti-corruption efforts in countries like China will depend on ensuring that those efforts do not become politicized. And the central role of political will, even as it is dangerous because it can always be perverted, but the central role of political will to the anti-corruption fight explains why it is so critical in our foreign policy to identify and support political openings as they emerge. New leaders elected on a platform of anti-corruption reform can change the tide if they make good on their commitments. So we can look hopefully at newly elected leaders such as President Ghani in Afghanistan or President Jokowi in Indonesia or Prime Minister Modi in India to assess whether or not their efforts in office will match their campaign pledges to boldly address corruption. We must accelerate our partnership with those reform-minded leaders when those strategic windows of opportunity open up. The United States can't create or control reformist leadership, but we can be ready and able to support it on behalf of people whose lives will be profoundly affected by the restoration of trust, efficiency, and justice. So in conclusion, since the establishment of International Anti-Corruption Day in 2003, many international fora have emerged, many commitments have been made to fight graft. The UN Convention Against Corruption now encompasses 173 countries. Regional bodies, like the African Union, have affirmed the UN's standards and conventions of their own. In the Americas, the OAS's peer review mechanism for the world's first anti-corruption convention, the Inter-American Convention Against Corruption, is now well regarded and respected. And we have near universal consensus on the norms for how governments should control corruption. It's a very important step, but it's too easy to become self-congratulatory about laws and about words. And the real problem before us is addressing the implementation gap in applying these norms. The impact on corruption on our own national security and the security of civilians around the world calls us to act, and the United States will work with like-minded partners toward a more focused, creative, and collaborative approach to combating corruption. I'd like to end with an adage from Liberia, which was actually emerged in response to the description of collective action against corruption. And it sums up the international challenge well. One straw of a broom can easily snap when trying to clean up the dirt, but when all of the straws of the broom work together, we can clean the house. So thank you all for being here, and I'll turn back to Sarah Chayes, and we can open up the floor for conversation. Thank you.
Fantastic. Putting your finger on the problem, but not just leaving us in the problem, but actually some really interesting examples of efforts and their impacts. And I think that was news. I think this is the first time a senior U.S. government official has drawn this connection between corruption and the myriad security challenges that the world's facing today. So thanks for that. Before turning to questions, and obviously we want lots from you, and we have some from overseas. As I said, this is an international day. I'm going to abuse, obviously, the, the mic that I have attached to me to just emphasize really a couple of points from that. One is a relatively technical one regarding Boko Haram. And I'd just like to emphasize that there's a tendency with Boko Haram, with Ukraine, to focus on the hollowing out of the military institutions as a reason for some of the security challenges that we've seen. But I would say in the case of Nigeria, the advance isn't just due to hollowing out of the army. Like the Taliban in Afghanistan and like the Arab Spring and the Ukraine revolutions, the expansion of Boko Haram is fueled in part by this indignation that Undersecretary Sewell was referring to at the corruption of the Nigerian government. I happen to just be back from there, so that's why I have it on the brain. I met, among others, the former governor of the central bank. His name is Lamido Sanusi. He was fired in February for reporting a $20 billion hole in the country's oil revenues to Parliament, and for bringing in the heads of a bunch of banks and saying he was going to take a look at their books to find out where that money may have gone. So it's that kind of corruption. It's systematic. It's in-your-face impunity. And it's all the way down to the level of the cop on the street that shakes you down in a humiliating way. That makes people furious. And furious people often get violent. And then all bets are off. I think we've heard a lot about Boko Haram. I think we've heard a little bit less about $20 billion and a central bank whistleblower. And that, I guess, brings me to my second point. You can't make it because you're in the government, but I can. And that's just to say this, and I'm speaking for myself here. The issue of political will applies not just to the governments of Nigeria or Afghanistan or Azerbaijan. It applies to Western governments too. We really have to look this in the face. It's true that the US has often led the way on anti-corruption, especially anti-bribery legislation and its enforcement and all of the other really interesting programs that you brought to our attention. But still, too often, anti-corruption is kind of relegated, right, to specialized teams more or less on the margins of U.S. foreign and security policy. So it's the work of USAID, it's the work of the Bureau of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement, or the desperately overworked kleptocracy unit in the Department of Justice. And so we really do get to this issue of mainstreaming, right? Too often, the mainstream policy practitioners, and by that I mean ambassadors, I mean generals in charge of forward deployed military units, they're so concerned about maintaining relationships with their counterparts that they're not really willing to make corruption part of the conversation. U.S. businesses are often fined for paying bribes to the same governments the U.S. government is concerned about offending. It's a kind of interesting double standard. According to, and you mentioned this, according to senior intelligence officials, we're not even systematically collecting or analyzing on the corrupt environments in which we're operating. We're not mapping the kleptocratic networks. We're not identifying the levers of power that they're really using to extract resources. We're not looking at identifying the revenue streams they're capturing or the key enablers that they rely on. And if Sarah's right, and I think she is, this is too critical an issue to be backburnered. It's a matter of vital national and international security. President Obama has said that absent a strategy that reduces the well springs of extremism, a perpetual war will prove self-defeating. Undersecretary Sewell has just laid out for us today one of those well springs and some of the elements of a strategy to reduce it. And for that, I thank you. So let's turn to questions. I think I'd like to, let me start with one from overseas since we have it, and I'll read it out. This is from a civil society organization, so it's really right in line with what Jay does. It's a movement called Speak Up, located in Kosovo. So what the interlocutor is saying is there's a whole bunch of institutions and mechanisms that are mandated to prevent and combat corruption in Kosovo. And there's an alphabet soup of them. The Anti-Corruption Agency, Department for Combating Economic Crimes and Corruption within the police, the state prosecutor, the special prosecutor, courts, ULEX, 2 different anti-corruption task forces, National Anti-Corruption Council. And yet, this year's just released Transparency International Perceptions Index puts Kosovo at 110th out of 177 countries. So in that context, do you think, how should Kosovo address this? Is the issue really kind of revamping the anti-corruption institutional structures in order to concentrate on results? Or are there just too many of these institutions? What's your sense of how a country in that situation ought to address the problem?
Well, I have to speak in general terms because I'm not familiar with the specifics of Kosovo. And so one of the most important questions, particularly in light of what we were just talking about, of course, is the political commitment. Mm-hmm. So that would be the place that I would start in terms of looking at the impact of the institutions. Another point to make in response to the question is, where was Kosovo 4 years ago on the index, right? Because these problems are really entrenched and really hard to make progress on. And so part of the answer is not the absolute, but the trajectory of progress against really, really intertwined and difficult challenges. But more fundamentally on the institutional question, Sarah, the reality is that different institutions are going to work in different contexts. It's really specific to the kind of corruption problem that you're facing, the makeup of the government, the makeup of the bureaucracy and the administration. There are so many different variables. And one of the things that has really struck me as I have been able to travel and engage in conversations with countries that address corruption through very different means is the diversity of approaches that they have. You know, Indonesia focuses itself on one core institution. It has some unique legal mechanisms that are available to it that might raise questions in other countries as to whether or not they are a deal with the devil worth making in terms of being different than normal procedures for justice. At the same time, I think most people would say that that focused approach, which has an extraordinary amount of autonomy and independence, has been extremely effective in a handful of very high-level issues, right? So that's a very different targeted approach from trying to root out corruption at the local level because you've got a particular police precinct that seems to be... So it depends in part on the problem. Again, one of the really interesting things about the Indonesia example is the degree of support that comes from civil society. So that's another question for a Kosovo friend is, where is civil society on this? And so there is no one right answer to what the institutional complexion of the solution should look like. But there are ways, and there are a lot of external organizations that can be of help to this questioner of how one might do the forensics on what is working and what is not working and what might need to be changed.
Do you want to select questions? I mean, we can just do this in a kind of... Okay, all right, great. So why don't we start right there in front? Could you identify yourself, and questions should be on the topic of the talk.
Of course.
Thanks.
My name is Roy Rosenblith, and I run an anti-corruption organization called Not in My Country. We develop web and mobile apps that empower people to fight corruption, particularly in higher education, so the next generation won't be as corrupt as the current generation in many countries. I wanted to highlight the fact that you brought up the issue of justice, institutions of justice in many countries, and you pointed out CICIG, the Commission Against Impunity in Guatemala, which has been fairly successful. I'd point out in Uganda, where we work, the U.S. State Department has financed to the tune of several $1 million. The Anti-Corruption Court and Human Rights Watch wrote a report called Letting the Big Fish Swim about how nobody's being prosecuted. Now, the difference between the two institutions is one had international prosecutors and was under the auspices of the UN. My question is, corruption seems to ultimately always start at the top. And if we have all these various efforts, but we are letting the big fish swim, and there's no mechanisms of dealing with them, particularly mechanisms of international justice. We have 7 global courts that govern trade, maritime disputes, investment, crimes against humanity? Isn't it time for an international court against corruption to create a credible threat?
To be honest, I think an international court will have both potential benefits, but also face a lot of obstacles, as have other courts that are still emerging, including the ICC most recently. And you still hear criticism in almost any venue about the difficulty of getting the big fish and what the prosecutorial strategies are, et cetera, et cetera. So no one institution is immune from the kind of criticism that has been leveled. I think one of the principles behind much international justice is that primarily justice is perceived to be more authentic and more lasting and achieve a wider variety of societal impacts when it is conducted nationally. And so, in a perfect world, I would rather see national prosecutions that work. But there is no question that we are early yet in this experiment of trying to really focus on and buttress accountability for corruption. And so there may come a time at which either a constellation of countries or the international community as a whole decides that national enforcement is just inherently flawed. I just think it's an open question, and I think there are strengths and weaknesses to both approaches.
Sir.
I just want to say thank you for...
Could you identify yourself? Sorry.
Yeah, Jeff Apperson. I'm the Vice President for the National Center for State Courts. And I'm the former Chief of Court Management for the Yugoslavia Tribunal. Some question was kind of relevant there. I just wanted to say, also, again, thank you. You raised a lot of points that I've been thinking about as I've been traveling recently, particularly in Pakistan and Georgia, Nigeria several times. And one observation I had, we were talking about top-down type of anti-corruption issues. I think of them also developing bottom-up. And you were addressing some of these alienation issues, which I think are, I call them, Chief Justice Jilani of Pakistan just wrote an opinion on the culture of anti-corruption and corruption in Pakistan, and also the regimes of disaffection that it was creating in society. And he pointed out one link, and I wanted to see what your thoughts were on this, and that is how the internet and the communication age is reinforcing the ability of these disaffected communities to propagate. And I thought his opinion regarding the language use and the hate language and the internet as a whole, and how we should consider somehow regulation in those environments nationally. I was wondering if you thought about that area particularly as it relates to these disaffected communities that are developing. So just a thought.
Well, thanks. I mean, there are a lot of different contexts in which regulation of the internet arises, not least of which is counterterrorism activity. And so, the United States position has been very protective of freedoms on the internet. And so I don't sense a groundswell of support for that within the United States. What I can say, though, is that I think technology seems to almost always be a double-edged sword, right? So the IPayToBribe.com phenomenon, which essentially is sort of the wiki posting of corrupt officials, offers a chance for those who are disaffected for a different set of, for those to empower those who are disaffected in a way that's very different and much more positive and much more directed at the problem. So I think the U.S. tendency will be to try to protect free speech and protect freedom to communicate, but that there are many ways to jujitsu the technology piece to have it help fight corruption.
Yeah.
One right there in the aisle.
I'm Vijayendra Kumar, and I'm in business. I'm an Indian American, so I go to India often enough. I thought one of the problems with, at least in business and corruption, was that the politicians and bureaucrats use the regulatory process for corruption. And so that, I don't know what the proper balance is, but there should be a balance between minimum regulation to avoid problems and getting rid of excessive regulation. And I think Modi is trying to do that. The other thing I found was that the awareness of the public is a major factor. So even 2 or 3 years ago, the public were getting very dissatisfied with the degree of corruption, and India was ripe for change. So I think awareness of the public, and also I don't quite know what the regulatory process should be.
Those are great comments.
Up front here.
David Crocker, School of Public Policy at the University of Maryland. You mentioned political will as a crucial factor here. I wonder if there isn't a moral will issue or ethical will issue. At the beginning, you said, of course, we know that corruption is bad, and then you nicely went on to identify lots of bad consequences. Is there a more direct moral argument that might be launched? And what might that be? Could it be related to a right not to have corruption, or an ethics of trust, or how might one go about it? One still hears around the edges, well, look, corruption is maybe bad, but it fuels the bureaucracy, it gets the lubricant going. Or we've always had it, we'll always have it. Sure, I'm against it, but if I have a chance to get it, then I will. It's not just the top-down or a bottom-up at all levels. Why search for a strategy or new principles or new effective ways of dealing with it if you're not in some sense morally committed that this is very bad and we need to find such a strategy?
Well, I think, for most, but not all laws, they're rooted in some normative sense of reality. And as I said, I think the issue isn't the norm. If I have $5 to spend on fighting international corruption, I'm not going to spend it on strengthening the norm. We've got agreement, on paper from political leaders' mouths that this is not acceptable, that this needs to change. The issue really is enforcement, and so I personally think that the next frontier for corruption is not to develop an underlying reason why the behavior that we agree is bad, even though I would welcome philosophical introspection into that point. But I think the real challenge for those who are concerned about corruption really has to do with how do you realize the common conclusion that everyone can mouth that corruption is a bad thing. So I think it's an important question, and I think different societies will have different degrees of satisfaction in how they try to pin the moral tinge of corruption to whatever their sort of national discourse is, or whatever their faith tradition is, or whatever they may do. But I don't think the question is whether the behavior is acceptable. I think we've got a consensus that it's not acceptable. What we don't have are adequate mechanisms to penalize those that engage in it and to prevent its occurrence in the first place. But I think it's a great question.
Just before, I'd like to turn again overseas to a second question we have. This one is from Mexico. It's from also civil society, Transparency International, Barbara and Rafael. Considering the strong economic ties between Mexico and the United States, how to avoid a double standard when U.S. companies are operating in Mexico? So they abide by law in the United States, but in Mexico, they're actually claiming cultural reasons, local cultural reasons, for participating in traffic of influence and facilitation payments, as it were. So apart from the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, what would be needed, to push to induce U.S. companies to behave in Mexico with the same kind of integrity that they do in the United States?
Well, we can use our law to hold corporations accountable for behavior overseas. So that's point one.
So it's enforcement here.
Yeah, I think enforcement here is clearly, it doesn't prevent, just because activity happens overseas doesn't mean it can't be enforced here. So that's point number one, and that doesn't mean to suggest that the United States is perfect on enforcement. There's always room to improve on that. But that's point number one. I think another interesting element of the question, and it gets back to this issue about where do you want the enforcement to happen, if there were national standards that were held and enforced within Mexico such that the environment was one in which one did not have to routinely bribe, you would reduce the likelihood that that activity would be engaged in by anyone. And so that would also help address the issue of double standard, because in addition to the enforcement of our own law, it is our standard. The problem there seems to be that the environment in Mexico remains one in which that is a separate standard. I think the broader point is, and a challenge for the business community itself, but I think perhaps civil society could do more in joining common cause with the business community, is how do you commoditize or monetize being law-abiding? How do you make that a comparative advantage in the business process? And so if we're trying to think of carrots as well as sticks, I think that's a venue. We have a lot of interest in organic cotton, or we have interest in ethically produced, coffee. And so, there are ways in which one can create value out of being legally compliant. So I think those are all relevant.
Really interesting. In the middle on the left. Yep. Just wait for the microphone and please introduce yourself.
Hello, I'm Shaska Byerly with the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict, and I'm also at the Center for Transatlantic Relations at SAIS. I have a question that has to do with protecting anti-corruption activists. In virtually every country in the world, there are really courageous people, whether they're in the government or in other institutions or within civil society or social movements and nonviolent campaigns that are in one way or another tackling some kind of corruption. And sometimes, at least in the past, they've been sort of left out of our notions of protecting human rights defenders or protecting those who are seeking some sort of, human right activities. I'm curious to ask, has the State Department done some thinking about how to expand its notions of protecting or shedding light, pressuring governments to not repress those who are fighting corruption in other countries, whether it's with their friendly countries or even with countries that are not friendly, but still it's important for the international community to raise their voices about abuses that are being committed against these types of activists. Thank you.
I think within the State Department, increasingly we are thinking of anti-corruption work as human rights work. I think there is a real sense of fusion of the two strands. And I would have to check, and Abby, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that anti-corruption activists would be eligible as human rights defenders for the small grants program run by DRL. So I think we're with you. I think you're right, it's not what we traditionally think of, but I think the State Department has moved, and that's very much a part of this effort to create a more ecumenical and a more integrated approach to thinking about anti-corruption measures.
I had promised you, I think, before. I'll come back.
Yeah, hi, Andrew Albertson. I'm with Creative Associates, and before I was working with USAID in Afghanistan, which is maybe where I was thinking about these questions more. But two quick ones.
One. There's a lot of people, sorry.
Okay.
I used to be a journalist. It was a drag when people ran out the clock.
Too often I think we think about the challenges in a local context as one thing, and the international input to the programs, to the technical capacity building that we can provide as a separate thing. And I really appreciate both in report and in your remarks the tying together of these two strands, that there's interactions between what the U.S. does or other external actors do and the challenge on the ground in corruption. And I really appreciated all the recommendations in the report related to thinking differently about our assistance, not thinking just as assistance as a mechanism to provide technical assistance related to corruption, but also thinking in terms of other aspects or other reforms in the assistance community. My question is, both in in our development aid, but also in our security assistance. Are there additional questions or additional things we can do to ask how to mitigate risks associated, risks to counterproductive effects, negative effects of our assistance? Can we assess or mitigate those risks in addition to leveraging our assistance to improve the local challenge?
Yes, among the more self-evident ways is to create what we have referred to in our office chat as transparent pipelines of security assistance, for example, where you have a clear accounting of inputs and then you have a clear accounting of outputs, and they're matched up and it's publicly available. So those are ways to mitigate risk in the context of delivering assistance as opposed to seeking to build up particular capacities geared at confronting corruption. And I think that is, again, when we talk about trying to mainstream anti-corruption efforts, it's trying to think about everything that we do as having some bearing on creating greater accountability, creating greater transparency, and holding not just ourselves but the recipients of our assistance to standards that we would expect within the United States in terms of knowing where our tax dollars go. So I think there's an enormous amount to be done. It's cumbersome. I mean, you think about one of the things that I've learned since coming back into government within the last year is just how regulated our systems are. And they're regulated for very good reasons. And they're regulated for our reasons. And I hate to be a proponent of more regulation. So when you talk about how do you make our assistance programs, more amenable to objective X and Y and Z, you're talking about increasing the complications of an already extremely complicated process. So, this is not a facile thing to do, but nonetheless, I think it's how we will have to move as we think about what it means to build in all our modes of interaction the kind of culture that we wish to see. Because just as I talked about how, as I think about whether it's the work of the Counterterrorism Office or the work of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement or the work of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, and I think about the programming that we do and the efforts that we make, corruption is a theme that is like a fugue that can run through everything that we do. And so we need to have an all-fronts way of trying to anticipate its impacts and mitigate its risks. But that is easier said than done when the folks who do such an amazing job running our programs are already trying to meet, for, as you would know, being an implementer of U.S. programming, or having been an implementer of U.S. programming, it's not an easy task. So it's going to be a work in progress, but I think the answer is absolutely.
Nat Myers with the Carnegie Endowment, formerly with USAID. On this topic of mainstreaming and coming from USAID, not to pick on the third D that we haven't mentioned as much, but where have you seen the Defense Department stand on this, and do you have any natural counterparts or allies within DoD that are able to make this case from within the Pentagon for why this is an issue? It's something which I think has been a lot more self-evident the last year with Iraq, but do you see traction there?
Well, I would have to defer to the Pentagon. I mean, I just don't know enough about the mechanics of what they do. What I can tell you is that both Iraq and Afghanistan, because of some very good Inspector General reports, have really highlighted this issue in the context of the security apparatus. But more fundamentally, many of the military folks that are on the ground seeking to do capacity building recognize the importance of integrity for leaders as leaders of troops, let alone as protectors of materiel. That the integrity piece has implications that go beyond just corruption, and they're often among the more sensitive to it. But in terms of the specifics of programming and how DoD does its business, I would have to refer you to them.
I'd just like to add 2 words to that, having been at DoD, at least on the strategic level. It's pretty interesting coming out of Afghanistan in particular. If you look at Admiral Mullen's last testimony before the Senate Armed Services Committee, John Allen saying that corruption was an existential threat to the Afghan government. Dunford released a really powerful report. I mean, it's interesting that on the military side, at least in terms of grasping the security nexus, they're actually sometimes ahead of civilians. Right next to Nat, there's someone.
My name's Winston Wood. I'm with the U.S. International Broadcasting Bureau, and I have a question and a request vis-a-vis.
Can you speak into the mic?
For those of you who expose corruption, one of our reporters with Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, was arrested in Azerbaijan on Monday. The charges, she's being held for pretrial detention on security charges, when in fact it culminates a series of reports she'd done on high-level government corruption. Aside from some bland statements from the podium, the United States government has approached her predicament as hands-off, sensitive matter to be handled quietly behind the scenes. I have to think that this is sending a signal to others in Azerbaijan that tackling corruption is a dangerous thing to do and will not receive the support from the international community, particularly the United States. So I would humbly request that you speak with your counterparts at state to try to be a little bit more proactive in her case, because she's doing what you do on the field of anti-corruption.
Well, thanks. If you can follow up with me afterwards and get me the information, I'm not familiar with the case.
You're unfamiliar with this case?
No.
It was on the front page of the New York Times yesterday.
I don't know the specifics of the case, so I'm not going to make public comments that would differ in any way from the U.S. position.
Hi, thank you, Cameron Parsons. Necessarily, given your position at state, this has had an international focus, but I was wondering if one or both of you could comment on what I see as a disturbing trend here in the United States, and that's the fact that in 39 states here, the judges are still elected and subject to corrupting influences of money. Do you care to comment in any capacity?
I think you want to defer to me, right? and so, I mean, one could wax poetic. This is, right, personal reflection from a United States citizen. One could wax pretty poetic. It's judges that are elected. It's the role of money in politics. It's a real subtle change in, so, you know, we live in Washington, D.C., right? And the governor of Virginia, the former governor of Virginia, was recently sentenced for corrupt behavior. But the big issue was there a quid pro quo? It was practically, did they sign a contract? Now, everybody knows that corruption doesn't work that way. Corruption, you know, the gift economy where corruption flourishes is much subtler than that. And I'd just like to say, with regard to that question, a wonderful book came out maybe about a month ago, called Corruption in America, from I think Benjamin Franklin's snuff box to Citizens United. And it's a beautiful analysis of the legal, I mean, it's almost a piece of, it's by Zephyr Teachout, who ran for governor of New York. So I just recommend you all read it. And I think, you know, again, this is kind of off our topic, but I think we all have to get mobilized, because it's leaking over. We're on the conveyor belt, I think, personally, of the types of countries that we're talking about, where corruption is beginning to fundamentally undermine democratic processes. And we're going to wake up one day and we're no longer in a democracy. So thanks for that question. All right. I think, you know, there's probably private conversations that will happen. We'd like to invite all of you. We've got a small reception downstairs, and the best way to get there is through the back, and there's some stairs right there. So please, let's network and scheme. And just before we go, we don't do coins at the Carnegie Endowment. That's, you know, I think you probably have a lot of coins. This isn't even for you, because you have one, right? I was wondering if you would be willing to hand this off to your boss so that we could maybe together help convince him of this nexus between security and corruption.
I will be delighted.
Thank you.
Thank you.